Hello, good morning everyone. My name is Arriaga and welcome to Mechanics-led Level Design. I'm a senior level designer in the AAA games industry, and first of all, thanks to Staffordshire University staff for inviting me here today. It's the second year that I present this topic, so it's great to see new faces. And yes, today we are going to be talking about games, levels, and how they complement each other. What kind of synergies can there be in terms of game development? So yeah, let's dive right into the topic. So first, a little bit introduction about me. As I mentioned, I have been in the industry for about 6.5 years. Currently, I'm working at HundredStar Games in a AAA unannounced project. Unfortunately, the project will remain unannounced today. And previously, I was working at Machine Games, a Microsoft studio. I was working on Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. Has anyone here played it? Okay, did you like it?
Yeah, good.
Perfect. So it released to critical acclaim, so if you haven't played it, I encourage you to play it. And previously, I was working at Ubisoft in an unannounced AAA title. And way back, I started my career on Assassin's Creed Valhalla, way back. And apart from that, I did some personal design projects that were covered by the mainstream games press, IGN, 80level, and so on. So, yeah, what is this topic about? What is this talk about? So here today we are going to be talking about mechanics, levels, and how they complement each other. We are going to be giving some specific tips that you can use in your design process so that you can get the most out of your development resources when designing. And at the end, we are going to close with a Q&A, some resources that you can use to dive deeper into the topic. And yeah, in the Q&A, you will be able to throw me any questions that you want related to this topic, to game design, to the game industry as a career, in terms of careers. And let's continue. So this is the outline of what we are going to be talking about. We are going to start with some basic definitions so that we have a shared common ground so that we have a shared language of what we're talking about. With some examples, we are going to analyze some game examples. And after that, we are going to take a look at the specific pipelines of development, the steps that come into developing a level with this mechanics-first mindset. After that, we are going to be talking about some constraints depending on the genre, how do we approach progression and difficulty aspects when balancing a game, how to merge narrative and gameplay, a little bit about emergent gameplay and unpredictability, and we are going to close with some failure and recovery states, some approaches to handle failure and recovery states. And at the end, again, we will close with the additional resources and the Q&A and some takeaways. So yeah, first of all, what makes a good level? And when I'm talking about levels, of course, most of you know what a level is, but just to have a general definition, levels are the spatial boundaries in which the games happen, and they can be either physical or abstract. So if we have a football match, the field is the level, and if we have a tic-tac-toe game, the square grid is the abstract space in which it happens. And I say that levels are good if their design elevates the experience. So levels are spaces that are experienced through interactions, and I say that a level is good if it conditions how players behave, what kind of decisions they make, and how they feel while making those decisions. If it's not only about the level being fun, it's about the level conveying exactly what we want. If we want to make the player feel powerless, if we want to make the player feel joy, if we want to make the player feel scared, depending on the general focus on our product, of our game. So yeah, let's start with this example of Titanfall 2. As you may know, Titanfall is a franchise that is a movement-based shooter in first-person multiplayer. And in this game, there are some iconic mechanics, like for example, wall running, and the level architecture, the geometry of the level has to convey those gameplay possibilities. It has to communicate to the player how they should behave, how they should play the game. So as you can see, for example, there are some really long and curved walls, some of the walls have a different color so that players automatically see these walls and say, oh, this is a surface that I can wall run through. And by doing so, we also condition how the players position against each other. We lead them into specific confrontation points, and we can more or less encourage different situations that players are going to face during the match. This level philosophy is completely different from, for example, this other example from Alien Isolation. This game is a first-person horror game, and here we don't need to have this kind of broad spaces with long curved walls. No, this game is about the player not knowing where the alien is hiding. So we need to convey all the possible spaces in which the monster might be hiding. We need to have a lot of shadows, a lot of covers. We need to have a much more oppressive kind of geometry. So again, level design is about establishing a language in which you convey to the player how they should play and how they should feel. So, if good levels guide interactions and they increase the impact of those interactions, and if game interactions are usually game mechanics, I would say that good levels are mechanic-led levels. So, to create good levels, first we need to understand mechanics. What is a mechanic, what makes a mechanic fun, and how can we design levels that elevate mechanics in a way that it improves our game and the experience of the player. So first, what is a mechanic? Of course you know, but again, to establish a common ground, it's any game action that we do to interact with the simulation systems. And if we have a parkour game, we have mechanics like climbing, running, etc. In a combat game, we have mechanics like attacking, parrying, and so on. So we need to ask ourselves, what makes a mechanic fun? And I like to approach this from the same point of view as the pyramids of needs of Maslow. This is a concept from psychology, and you might have already seen that before, but it is basically a hierarchy of different biological needs that people have, from the most basic one, which is the physiological needs, not feeling hungry, not feeling cold, till the upper ones, which are more abstract. They are about self-actualization, about self-esteem and belonging and love for other members of society. And games are not going to stop making you hungry. Games usually focus on the upper ones. But we have to ask ourselves, why do games feel fun? And the reason is that way back when we were hundreds of thousands of years ago, our ancestors, when they were out there in the wilds trying to survive, their brains, the way evolution works is that brains are wired to reward us, to give us dopamine if we are able to overcome challenges, because overcoming challenges means that we are able to survive. So in games, we simulate those challenges, we establish them in a progressive way so that players feel that they are learning, and if the game tells the player, you would be good enough to survive if you were out there in the wild, that makes the brains of the players release dopamine. So how does this work? For example, tic-tac-toe, we have strategic thinking, so the players can think ahead. The players kind of need to foresee what the opponent is going to make. So if the player wins the tic-tac-toe match, he's like, oh, I would be able to foresee the strategy of a predator if I was out there in the wild. It sounds very outlandish, but this is actually what is happening behind the scenes in our brains. It's how evolution works. Pong, reflexes. Again, if we are able to react to sudden changes in our environment or in the movement of our opponents. Minecraft, creativity. If you have limited resources or if you have a full sandbox playground, it is about what kind of solutions you are able to come up with. Creative creatures are the ones that survive out in the wild. Even games like I Spy with My Little Eye for little kids, they are about being aware of your surroundings. Or picture puzzles. If you have something that is broken, you suddenly lose control of it, and this loss of control makes you feel bad. You suddenly are not in control of the situation and you are vulnerable. So when we are able to restore things, it makes us feel powerful, it makes us feel good, even if it is subconscious. So a fun mechanic tells us that we are good enough, that we would be able to survive in a simulated environment, of course. And the way the game conveys that is through 3 points. 1, feedback. Feedback needs to be audiovisual, so it's explicit. And there is a second type of feedback, which is implicit, which is more about the consequences of what happens in the game. For example, the narrative consequences. We also have progress. We need to show that the player is learning across the game, because if the players are not learning, what is the point? The brain would say, what is the point of me doing these repetitive actions? And apart from increasing the difficulty, we can show progression, for example, teaching the player something about the game and then forcing them to extrapolate that knowledge into a different context, into a different situation. And the third point, fairness. Challenges have to feel fair. Players need to feel that they stand a chance. So how does a level support a mechanic? And I like to approach this from the point of view that supporting equals teaching. A game should always be trying to teach something to the player about the world. And it sounds a bit nerdy, but teaching is fun. Learning is fun. You just have to do it in style. If you manage that your game teaches the game rules and the different game behaviors in a very specific style that conveys your personality, people love that. So first, we establish the conflict, we set the goal, what the player needs to achieve, we set an obstacle, and through the process we communicate everything that is required, what are the rules of the simulation, because every game has slightly different rules. We have to allow, very important, a safe space for players to experiment. If we teach a mechanic, we need to let the player play with it and see what are the different possibilities. And we need to present the constraints that the mechanic has. If there is ammo, if the environment reacts differently to certain interactions, etc. Then we add the progression, as I mentioned, and at the end we add twists and surprises, so that the brain keeps engaged along the full process. So yeah, I like to start using some examples from Valve game studios. For example, in this game is about Portal. And Valve, they are masters at presenting exposition to the players. And in this case, you can see, for example, that the game starts with you enclosed in this glass space, isolated space. There is a counter in the wall, and the counter is reaching from 1 minute until 0, so you know that there's nothing going to happen until that counter reaches to 0. You have a safe space to experiment, you can't roam around. The only things you can do is pick the objects, the physical objects, and interact with them. And this is the perfect way to start the game, because we ensure that the player has a safe space to experiment with the basic mechanics. As the counter approaches to 0, the portal opens, and the player doesn't choose where to put the portals. The portals open at predefined locations that are carefully selected, so that think that you are in Portal, you are in first person, but by placing the portals in these positions, the player is able to see their avatar, so we can know what our character looks like. We can start to empathize with our character, to connect with the character, and this also conveys something more important. At first, the player doesn't know if the portal is a portal across time, across different rooms. He doesn't know the rules of the game. So by showing the avatar, that the avatar moves when you move, and that the portals are next to each other, and they move you across the same room, it conveys the rules of the simulation of those portals. Also, it makes you walk around the room, and walking around an object, walking around a small room, it helps you create a mental mapping of what the space is like. It's not the same as standing still and seeing it through a window. So in the next room, the player stands on top of the button. The button is connected to the door through this dotted line, and we see that the door opens when the player touches the button. We also see the cube, and we know because of the previous room that we can manipulate objects. So 1 + 1 is 2, we grab the cube, we can put it on top of the button, and the door opens. Again, it's very basic, but it's a gradual progression. Every room teaches something in advance from the previous one. This is the same as in this room, in which the player drops down, and again there are the portals and the line connecting the button with the door, but in this case the cube is behind a glass. So it is a progression of the previous puzzle. Now we need to find our way to get into the room, grab the cube across the portal, so we are teaching that we can grab objects across portals, and we have to put it onto the button, a progression of the previous challenge. In this other room, what the game teaches is that when you place an object on top of a button, it doesn't necessarily have to activate the button. It needs to have a specific weight. And this is important because it means that from now on, when the player is going to be playing the game, they are only going to look for heavy cubes. They are not going to get distracted by small objects. And at the end, after we have learned all the rules of the simulation, only then we can see the portal gun. We see it shooting the portal, so we understand what it does. We don't have a text box explaining us what the gun does. And we have to stand in a moving platform until we reach that portal. So we ensure that the players get that information before they can interact with it. So again, everything is a progression, and at every moment we are teaching something to the player. Half-Life 2, another game from Valve. In this case, you have a gravity gun, and they have to convey that you can use that gravity gun as a weapon by throwing objects. And they could just have put the gravity gun on a table and gave you the explanation in a text box, or have a character explaining to you, but it wouldn't create an emotional connection. And the thing is that our brain, the part of our brain that processes the memories, is next to the amygdala, the part that processes emotions. So if you want to create memories, it's better if they are emotional memories because of proximity. If the part of the brain that creates emotions gets stimulated, it creates more neural networks across this area of the brain, and therefore it increases the memories of the player. So always create emotional memories. So the way they do that is they put this dead body cut in half by the saw blade. So by presenting a shocking image first, you are first going to remember this situation, even if it's subconsciously, and the image automatically conveys that this saw blade can be used as a weapon. It can be used to cut enemies in half. So the moment that the player picks this saw blade from the wall, there is a script that activates the enemy on the other side of the room. The enemy is separated from the player by an obstacle, so there is some kind of safe space for experimentation, and the first idea of the player is, okay, I saw this saw blade that cut an enemy in half, so I'm going to pick this saw blade and I'm going to throw it to the enemy and cut him in half. In the next example, the player moves some barrels here, the barrels roll a little bit, they touch this alien trap, and we can see that the alien trap picks the barrel up. So we are teaching the rules of the simulation with some exposition. The exposition happens because of player actions, so they can see action and reaction. And after that, we see an explosive barrel, we see the same kind of traps, and we are like, oh, maybe I can extrapolate that knowledge that I learned just a few seconds before, and I can use the explosive barrel with these alien traps. So again, we are planting an idea on the mind of the player, and players are going to feel as if they came up with the idea, although of course it's an idea that we as designers carefully planned. Mario 1-1. There is an excellent video from Extra Credit's YouTube channel talking about this, but a quick overview is about how at the beginning you see that the first thing that the player faces is the Koopa enemy that moves across the level horizontally, and first we have the player on the left of the screen so that we know that we have to walk to the right. Seems very basic, but think of the first people that played Mario back in the day. They didn't know that. So games need to teach things intuitively, and by putting the enemy, you ensure that the player has to jump in order to progress. If you don't jump, you don't progress, so you make sure that the player knows that. And they are going to press all buttons because the Game Boy doesn't have many buttons, and they are going to see that one of them jumps. So we learn that the player can kill enemies by jumping on top of them. We have this cube that when it gets hit accidentally, because coincidentally the cube was placed right in near to the enemies, so players are going to end up hitting them. And we see that there is a coin. Coins are good. We understand that cubes are good. And in the next cube, it is a breakable cube, but we can't break it, and we just see it reacting. So we are like, oh, this is reactable, but I can't interact with it yet. And yeah, when we hit the cube expecting a coin like in the first cube, suddenly we get the mushroom and the mushroom bounces against the pipe, so we don't really have time to react against it. We touch the mushroom and at first we don't know if the mushroom is good or it is bad. We can expect that it is like the Koopa enemy, we can expect that it is bad. But because we don't give reaction time to the player, the mushroom is going to unfairly touch the player, but it's going to make the player bigger, so we understand that it is a power-up, it is not something that damages us. And next, we show that the enemies bounce against the pipes, back and forward, so we show the different interactions between the enemies and the environment. So again, level design is about teaching. So let's dive into the pipeline, into the specific steps of designing. And at first, we have the framework and the constraints. When you design a level, you have to think what your canvas looks like. What are the constraints? There are few times in life in which you are going to have a blank check to design your level. So think about what the product needs, how does the level fit in the big picture of your game. Are there mood constraints, tone constraints, narrative constraints? Is there any specific tech feature that you need to showcase to the audience, to the players? And are there any location constraints? Does the level need to take place because of the franchise requirements, or maybe because of the narrative requirements, it needs to take in a specific kind of location? And when you have your idea of what checkbox you need to tick, you need to see what are your resources, how many people you have, what kind of expertise your team has, if your team is leading more into a story, more into art, more into programming, so that you can make the best kind of level with your resources. So it is basically a Venn diagram. In one hand you have what you are able to develop, in the other hand you have what your game needs, and in the middle there is this sweet zone, which is what your next level should be about, and if you are lucky, it will align with what you want to do. And the second step of the pipeline is the mechanic, so you need to find out which mechanic best conveys what you want to teach to the player. And the way I like to go about this is you can look at previous experiences in your life and try to extrapolate the feelings that those experiences created and what made those experiences feel this way. For example, let's say that you are making a game about defusing bombs. So you want to think about what kind of feeling someone feels while doing that and what experiences can you relate from that. For example, building a house of cards. It is something that requires very careful, precise movements. If something moves out of your control, it can completely destroy the situation. So it has some equiparable features, building a house of cards with defusing a bomb in a very abstract way. So you think what makes that experience feel this way? Maybe you need to move very slowly, maybe there are high stakes. So you translate that into actual game mechanics. You think about the input that your game has and you try to say, okay, this experience felt this way because of these reasons, and my game is going to feel the same way because I'm translating those same reasons. Or for example, if you are making a game about the feeling of freedom, maybe you can relate to when you were riding a motorbike or cycling or skating, and it is about the flow of movement, about maybe moving close to other dangerous obstacles. So yeah, always try to think of relatable things, because most of the times we humans tend to live very similar lives between each other, and there are a lot of relatable things between you and your players. So yeah, the third step is the proof of concept. You prototype the mechanic and you get your hands dirty into the engine. And you don't do it in the actual game map, because games tend to become big, tend to become bloated and messy, and you don't want to break things while you are prototyping. So you go into a gym map, they are called, or a testbed map, and it is basically an empty map with some cubes, some specific situations, as simple as possible, so that you can test your mechanic and see where it fails, where it succeeds. And the objective is to validate. At every point of the development, games are iterative processes. It is not about carefully planning for a long time and then executing. It is about iterating as many times as possible, so that you can find the answers to the questions that you don't know. When you start development, no matter how many games have you done in the past, you never know what ticks exactly. So you need to prototype, experiment, and validate with playtesting. And of course, if you have a gym map and you are prototyping things, you can also test the depth of your mechanic. If you take one thing and put it in a different system of your game, how does it behave? If you introduce this constraint, is it suddenly better or worse? Because sometimes a bad mechanic or a bad gameplay situation, it becomes much better when you introduce a constraint. And the fourth step of the pipeline, you find the setting. You have a general idea of the location at the beginning when you established your framework, but you have to, in order to find all the gameplay possibilities that you can create, you need to do a lot of research. This is easier if it is a game based on reality, but also if the game is based on a specific intellectual property, you research a lot of it because players like that intellectual properties are respected. If you are doing a game about Lord of the Rings or about whatever existing franchise, it is very important to respect the source material. But also because researching will give you a lot of ideas for points of interest. In the example of Battlefield 4, they had this engine feature that they wanted to showcase, Levolution, dynamic destruction, a combination of dynamic and scripted destruction. And they said, okay, we want to destroy something huge. What's the biggest thing we can destroy? A skyscraper. And because of narrative constraints, the game takes place in China. So they said, where are the biggest skyscrapers? And they said, okay, we are going to do a level in the financial center of Shanghai, and we are going to have this huge skyscraper that gets destroyed, and because we want to showcase the aftermath of destruction as much as possible, we are going to put water around the skyscraper so that it does a shockwave. We are going to have, they researched the area and they saw gameplay possibilities, for example, a subway station where players can hide when the skyscraper is collapsing. Or maybe this other building is a good place for helicopters to land, and so on. You research and you come up with gameplay possibilities, which will later be your Lego pieces when you design the walkthrough. You pick all your pieces, all your Lego pieces, and you try to arrange them in a way that creates different game beats with a specific pacing, with a specific order of progression that teaches things to the players. And the point is to create an evolution of the player across the level in which the players feel that they are always becoming better, always progressing and learning something. So yeah, there are different ways to do that, and it depends a lot on the philosophy of your studio, but I like to approach this from the philosophy of, personally I like to approach this with bullet points, with flowcharts, because it is much easier to change something on paper than to change it on the engine. But also don't spend too much on paper, because only the engine and only playtesting can validate your plans and tell you if you have a good assumption. So there are different kinds of structures that you can use in terms of pacing, the hero's journey, the 3-act story structure. This is not only exclusive to games, of course, you might remember this from literature class, or this is also used in movies, theater, etc. Any kind of storytelling, it is usually about different kind of progressing a pacing curve. We are going to talk later a little bit more about that, with an inciting incident, a rising action leading to a climax and a resolution. And the sixth step of the level development is actually getting our hands into the engine, starting the blockout, the gray box. We build the architecture with the most basic geometry. We don't add things yet. We are just trying to validate if our metrics work. We try to find out how long it takes to the player to move from one position to the other, how players feel in this kind of architecture, if players are led to the destination in an effective way, and at all points try to sync with art, even if you aren't arting the level yet, because you can gather a lot of useful feedback from them. You can also make them feel that like they own the process as well. It is important that your team feels that they are doing a shared work. So yeah, after you have a basic geometry, you implement gameplay, you put placeholders for a scripted event, for the quest flow. You don't go into details, you are just trying to get to the most basic, cheapest state in which you can validate if your assumptions work. So build everything in a very basic way, and you playtest early, and when things are more or less ready for art to enter, And the moment in which it is at a good stage to introduce art is when you making changes to the level is not going to make their life hell. So you evolve things up to the basic point in which they can come in, then you greenlight it to them, and from that point you evolve the level across in combination with your environment artist. And yeah, the environment artist iterates the level, you go back over it, and you try to analyze what changed, if it impacted any of the design considerations that you have, and step by step you reach the final stage. It is usually better to leave your level, always try to do, well, this is going to depend a lot on your production requirements, but it is sometimes better to leave your first levels for the end, because you will have learned things across the development, and you can use that in your first levels, which are going to be the first impression of your player. So it's also good that you leave your level after you finish it, you leave it for a while, you focus on other parts of your game, and you come back to it later on with fresh eyes. So yeah, some best practices. The rule of cool is very important in games, it helps to sell, but the rule of making sense is even more important. Good games are cool, but great games are cool while making sense. So always try to think, what does the player know at this point? Does it make sense that I put this situation to the player in this very specific moment in the big picture of your game? Always be wary about player agency and linearity. It's always a challenge between wanting to show things in the way you want and letting players make their own choices. Trust your players. Always ask yourself if you are teaching the players the right thing at the right moment. Kill and change features early. It is much easier than doing it when they are advanced, and it will make for a better product. Fail fast, playtest frequently, communicate with your team, and keep consistent rules and style. Don't make exceptions for that specific game moment that you want to create. Always try to make things fit into the rules of your world, because if your rules are consistent, that means that players can predict what things in the game are going to do and can plan ahead and make strategies with that. So progression and difficulty, there are some curves here. They are the flow curves and the intensity curves. Usually you want to keep the difficulty in this sweet area between it being too difficult that players disconnect and too easy that so easy that players get bored. You want to stay in the middle, and you want to ramp the intensity across the game in a regular manner. You want to introduce breathing moments. You don't want to always be raising the tension, because otherwise brains will shut off. You need to introduce some breathing there. And yeah, you can introduce some progression in even in sandbox games that are not linear. You can introduce some kind of progression with the way players unlock mechanics, with different soft or hard gates, like needing a specific level to access an area, or ensuring that when the player crosses a point, they can't come back. These are usually called valves in level design. You can balance things with the position in the map. If things are farther from the player, it is going to take a bigger risk to go to them than if you go to nearer areas. So you can kind of make a golden path even in a sandbox environment and plan the pacing and the flow according to that golden path. There are some constraints: camera, metrics, spatial intimacy, and visual language. If your game is first or third person, there will be some consideration in terms of level design. You will have to deal with narrower metrics in first person. You will have to deal with a higher level of detail, which also has a bigger cost for environment art. You will have to deal with verticality in games. It is usually easier to implement verticality in your levels in first person, because if you have to rotate the camera, it means there is less movement in first person, in which the camera only rotates, than in third person, in which the camera pivots around the character and displaces a bigger distance. And if your game is has fixed cameras or on-rail camera sequences, an isometric game, for example, usually has a relatively fixed angle camera. So in those situations, it is cheaper to create environments and to make things look good. But of course, it has freedom restrictions for the players. Some metrics considerations. So narrower metrics will create a more intimate but also more claustrophobic feelings for the player, and wider metrics, they are usually better for broader game actions. If you have a game that is about freedom, about flow, they usually work with wider metrics, and if you have a game that is about interacting with the environment, it will work with narrower metrics better because you don't have to explore so much, you don't have to walk so much around in order to interact with the environment elements. But of course, this depends on your game systems, your character controls, and all that. Refuge and prospect spaces. Refuge spaces, they are spaces in which you feel hidden, you feel protected, but you can also feel trapped, and you have limited awareness of your environment. And prospect spaces are spaces that are more open. They can create agoraphobia on the player, or they can create freedom. This depends on how the movement of your player is and how your player is in relationships of power with the rest of the elements in the environment and the game. If your player is overpowered, you will feel free. If your player is underpowered, you will feel vulnerable and scared in a big open environment without covers. And there are also vantage points. Batman games do that a lot, for example, in which you have these gargoyles in which the character can stand on top, they can survey, they can analyze the area, and this gives the player the feeling that they are a predator and the enemies are the prey. You have to develop some kind of visual language in terms of design. There are some stereotypes, so to say, that are used across games, and you can benefit from that, from those icons. Shooters, for example, they tend to have a lot of rectangles in which, when you see a rectangle, you automatically assume this is a cover. So if you are making covers, go first with rectangles rather than with other kind of shapes. And if you are doing a platforming game, usually games tend to rely a lot on yellow or white paint. The reason is that the photosensors that we have in our eyes, they react more to yellow color. This is, again, evolutionary reasons. So if you use yellow or white, players are more likely to see it. Of course, it depends on the rest of the art direction of your environment. But they are good for player leading, but also don't try to be too cliché. Players recognize patterns, and you don't want to break the immersion of your game and say, hey, this is a game. No, I mean, depends on the style of game, but usually if you are doing a realistic immersive game, you want your game to not feel like a game. And stealth, you can use shadows and lights, or in RPGs you can have NPC clusters and flags that usually signal, oh, there's some action there, there's some interaction there, so I'm going to go there and see what's going on. Ludonarrative dissonance, you need to keep your mechanics and your narrative in the same direction. This is sometimes difficult if you want to portray a more dramatic kind of story. If you have a game that, for example, talks against violence, but suddenly your mechanics feel super fun, there's some kind of dissonance there, so you need to be able to find a way to make things match. Like, for example, you have Bioshock Infinite is one of my favorite games, but the problem it has is that while it is a very dramatic game and you really empathize with the character Elizabeth, this character is throwing you coins across the environment, throwing you ammo, and resources. So the thing is that it kind of takes away, it makes the character feel useful from a gameplay point of perspective, but at the same time it kind of takes away from the dramatic moments a little bit. Spec Ops: The Line, it's a game in which, again, the way they do this, they handle ludonarrative dissonance, is they make you have fun shooting at enemies, and then they make you feel bad for those enemies. So it kind of plays into the guilt. It uses the ludonarrative dissonance as part of the narrative theme of the game. There is this indie game called Loneliness, which is just a cube that moves and the other cubes get away from you, and the color palette is gray, it is dull, and just because of the title, because it is called Loneliness, this game conveys the feeling of the other cubes not wanting to have anything to do with you. So it is conveying a narrative with the mechanic itself, with just moving and having the environment react to your movement. A little bit of emergent gameplay. When you have unintended interactions between the game systems, this creates consequences that the designer didn't expect or that can create for special moments. If you have, for example, in Zelda, they have a chemistry and physics system in which if you have metal on your body and you go into the storm, it is going to attract lightnings, and this kind of interaction between game elements, you can use that for the players to create strategies, for your game to feel alive. And the important thing is that emergent gameplay needs to be deterministic. It doesn't need to be scripted situations, but it needs to be rules, and the combination of elements creates the situations, not scripted narrative situations. And yeah, they usually work best in sandbox non-linear levels, but they require that your player knows the rules of the simulations very well, so you need to explain it to them in a way that is fun and makes sense. You can have systemic emergent gameplay in which the systems interact with each other. You can have social emergent gameplay in which the different roles of the characters complement each other. For example, if you have a specialist that is a healer or a specialist that acts as a tank taking damage from the enemies, you have this combination between the different synergies of roles in the team. Or you can have narrative emergent gameplay in which Dwarf Fortress is the game there, and it is an example of a game in which you have systems that create narrative consequences and create a story that the designer did not anticipate. So the way to create emergent gameplay is that if you are doing a puzzle, for example, don't make it a binary puzzle in which you have a key lock and you have a lock and a key. You want to do something more in the style of, you have, for example, an enemy guarding an entrance instead of a door, and that enemy might react to sound, might react to fire, might be scared, might get angry, and there are resources in the environment that might create those reactions. So if you have explained the player how the rules of the simulation works, the players are going to experiment with the elements of the level, and it provides for more depth and more satisfaction than just patting a door and giving the player a key, or allowing the player to find a key. So yeah, it is about player freedom. You have to ensure that players have access to the resources in order to trigger those emergent gameplay situations. You minimize hard scripting and you don't punish experimentation. You give safe areas for players to experiment. Emergent gameplay comes with unpredictability. Chaos is good in those cases, but emergent gameplay also means emergent bugs, so be careful about the exponential amount of bugs that comes whenever you introduce things like physics or multiplayer. Multiplayer is good because it creates new content just from how players interact with each other. And in the case of replayability, in the case of chaos and unpredictability, it also increases the replayability of your game, and there is an element of luck whenever there is chaos, and you can, designers, we are master manipulators, and we can manipulate luck behind how lucky players feel. Let's say that players, for example, are about to lose a combat situation. Suddenly, we can make enemies be less accurate with their shots, so you will still have bullets flying near to you, but they are not going to hit you if you have low health. And in this way, we can tweak luck, and players will not know that, but they will feel the satisfaction of the moment. So remember, the first rule of the casino is that the most fun moment is not when the wheel stops and you have won, is when the wheel is still spinning. And failure and recovery systems, of course, if to have a meaningful win, you need to have a meaningful fail. Always, the important thing is to always give feedback to the player why the player failed, why the game was lost. And for recovery systems, they condition the playtime and they control the pacing. Depending on the way you set your checkpoints or other type of recovery systems, you can give the players more space to breathe, you can punish the player more or less, you can raise the stakes of the game or lower them. So you can have hard failures in which you force the player to restart, but you can also have softer types of failures in which the player loses resources or it takes a longer time to reach some situations. They increase risk versus reward, and you can have narrative failures in which the player feel like they are missing content or locking some narrative branches by losing some gameplay actions. And in terms of recovery, you not only have checkpoints, but you can also play with the health and the resources regeneration. You can play with, you can introduce things like time rewind, like Forza games do, so that players can try again and try to improve their previous mistake. You can choose to punish the players or not for using those recovery systems. So it is part of a strategy. If I have a recovery system and I can choose whether I use it or not, it is also part of my strategy to see how can I become the best player possible. And you can have alternative solutions. For example, if you lose a stealth situation, you transition into combat. So you are punishing the player, but at the same time, you are allowing them to progress and to not have to... The thing is that if you break the magic circle, so to say, there is this concept called the magic circle, which is where the game happens. If you make the player lose in the game, this is going to break the immersion of the game. This is going to say, this is a game. So as in an ideal situation, players don't lose a single time in the game, but they always feel that they could lose and that losing has high stakes. You can have rewards like different shortcuts to reach different stages or progression of the character. You can make the player lose resources or points or gain that. You can have additional content, give narrative closure, or boost the self-esteem of the player by placing, you know how in games, in multiplayer competitive games, you sometimes have this, the ranking and the leaderboards, and you see the best players of the match at the end of the game. This is so that you feel, oh, how good is this player? It boosts the self-esteem of the player, and it encourages the other players to reach to be there in that screen when they play. And the last section, failure and recovery best practices. Always signpost and give visual feedback about why your players fail or win. Always make your situations fair, give players a chance, which is sometimes very difficult if your game has chaos elements like 5, 6 and so, because you can't predict everything that is going to happen in your game. So yeah, be careful about fairness in emergent gameplay. Always make your difficulty scalable by modifying the space, modifying the game ingredients, modifying the frequency and the cost of the recovery systems that you put across your level. And always give a balanced risk-reward. You can give the player choices and say, okay, maybe if you invest more time or more resources or a bigger risk into going for this, then the reward has to be equally higher. So takeaways of this presentation. After this information dump, if you go out, I want you to stay with 3 key things. First, what does the player know? What do I want to teach to the player? And how can my mechanics and my level convey that information to the player in a way that is interesting, that is fun, that conveys the tone and the constraints of my game, and that makes players feel that my choices were the choices that the player made. And yeah, it is about how do I get the most value out of my mechanics, out of my development resources. Here are some additional resources that you can take a look. They are the sources for my presentation. You can scan this with your phone if you want, so that will give you the different links for the presentation. And yeah, it's a lot of the information from my presentation comes from these great videos and great talks and great articles. And yeah, I will share it with the staff anyways, but yeah. And the Q&A. So yeah, at this point you can ask me anything about design, about the game industry and career, how to better approach the game industry, or my experience in different studios. So yeah, thank you so much for being in this presentation.